All right, hi. I'd like to show you a little bit more about figurative language in the opening parts of the Kite Runner. Let's focus on the yellow highlights, and I'll explain a little bit more about the other colors after. So, the very first line in the novel, he says, I became what I am today at the age of 12 on a frigid, overcast day. So immediately we have a sense of imagery, and a lot of authors do this because it helps open up the setting and allow us to visualize in more detail and be more interested in the story. So in this case, it appeals to sight and touch. Um, if we continue, he mentions this idea of the past. And he says here, I've learned about how you can bury it because the past claws its way out. So immediately when he's mentioning that the past claws its way out, he's comparing the past, which is an idea, to perhaps an animal or a dark figure, could be almost like a demon or demonic, something quite negative, coming back to sort of, we can say, haunt you in some ways. So when he says bury it, it's also part of that, since the it replaces the antecedent, which is the past clawing its way out. So that's what I've highlighted here. It's a human-like threat, even though it's an idea. Therefore, it's not literal, it's figurative. He uses a lot of figures of speech throughout the novel, but he says, I've been peeking into that deserted alley. So first he was mentioning the actual alley, and here the deserted alley is something he's peeking into, but it's in his mind. That's why it's not literal. If we continue, there's a line that says, it was my past of unatoned sins. So here he uses a metaphor, and he says that the sins are actually on the other lines. So basically, we know that sins is an idea. It's not something that can literally call you, unless it's in some kind of like thriller sci-fi film where it becomes something that's alive. But in this sense, it's really figurative. So that's why we have to include it in figurative language. Moving on, he continues to describe the scene. The early afternoon sun sparkled on the water. And of course, this is just appealing to our sense of sight and how we perceive light hitting on the water. As we move on, he uses quite a bit of personification in the novel as well. And here he's comparing the kites, and he's describing the kites, and he's using human qualities to describe them, because we know that kites don't literally dance. Humans dance, and so we're ascribing those human-like qualities to these inanimate objects. And it just sounds better. And suddenly Hassan's voice whispered in my head, for you 1,000 times over. So this is a figure of speech that's used. It's also hyperbole, because he doesn't literally mean that Hassan would do something from 1,000 times over, but it's a way of saying that I would do anything for you. So it's an exaggeration. And lastly, this part here, it's really providing a sense of imagery for a sense of hearing. Hassan's voice whispering is compared to this way, or it helps the reader imagine what it's like when we remember or recall perhaps a loved one speaking to us. I'll just move on to the next page here with the rest of the yellow highlights for figurative language. So we have another figure of speech, I can still see. We use that a lot to describe, like, as if even though it was so long ago, I still remember it as if it was yesterday, kind of thing. But it also recalls vivid detail. As we move on, there's this comparison of Hassan to a doll chiseled from a Chinese doll maker. At first, it's a simile. He uses like to compare, and so that is one of those flags that helps us see that. And if we continue down here, he continues with the Chinese doll maker, and this is still a comparison, but it's a metaphor. So it doesn't have like or as, and he's extending the metaphor to continue with this description. If you want to go deeper in questioning, though, what is the metaphor of in terms of who is the Chinese doll maker? So could it be like a godlike figure? You could go into like a second layer of representation if you really wanted to. If we were to look at the other highlights in blue and purple and over here in green, they signify different ideas. For instance, symbolism or motifs or foreshadowing, which are all literary techniques. However, they're not figurative language. So I will mention them and we will explore them in a bit more detail. This is what I'd like to focus on a little bit more. It's more about storytelling. And so here I say, what does this show rather than tell? Please answer. What I'd like for you to do is read this passage and go through the tutorials that I posted in ManageBack. They are documents that explain how authors show rather than tell. And I want you to try to answer these. So here's the same question. What does this show rather than tell? I'm in his arms, but it's Rahim Khan's pinky fingers are curled around. Another line here is the same question. What does this show rather than tell? In the 18 years that I have lived in that house, I stepped into Hassan and Ali's quarters only a handful of times. So this will make more sense once you read through the brief tutorial that explains more about showing versus telling. That's it for this segment, and we'll get back with showing versus telling with the second tutorial.